Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your hosts, Chris Jennings and Dr. Mike Brasher.
We have an exciting show today. Mike, I want you to go ahead and introduce this one. This is another species profile that we're going to do, and these shows have been wildly popular. So today we chose
the gray duck, the Gadwal.
The gray duck, commonly known as the Gadwal. And a funny story about that before we get into the serious part of it, when I came down from Indiana, I think I hunted down in South Louisiana one time, and these guys are like, oh, there's just gray ducks everywhere, gray ducks everywhere. And I'm sitting there looking around like, what is a gray duck? I had no idea. So that's good that you kind of reference the common man term, especially from South Louisiana, as the gray duck. But let's get into the gray duck. Let's do a little bit of an introduction from you about the Gadwal.
Chris, I think what we'll do here is we'll start, having done about 3 or 4 of these. I guess this is the 4th one that we've done now. I'm going to start by just talking about the taxonomy a little bit. One of the next things that we'll talk about is the appearance, that kind of stuff. But from a taxonomic standpoint, Gadwal are another species that falls within the dabbling duck kind of tribe, Anatinae, and it is another one of these species that I've talked about before that has gone through several different kind of taxonomic reclassifications. The latest and current classification for this species is known as Mareca strepera. If you were to kind of roll back the clock a few years, it would have been in the Anas, A-N-A-S, genus Anas strepera. And then if you go back even farther, and this is something that that's on one of these posters here at headquarters. There was a time, and actually you can still find some references to this, where it was recognized as a different genus, and I'm not even sure if I'm going to pronounce this correct, but it's Chalilosmus streperis. No idea what the origin of that is, but that was a monospecific genus, basically meaning the Gadwal was the only species in that genera.
You could have just winged that, and I would have totally trusted you that you knew it.
Well, that's about as good as I can do. So in terms of taxonomic relatives, which other species is it closely related to? There's really 2 of them that falls into that category. One of them people are going to be familiar with. That's the American widgeon. It's another one that has also gone through a taxonomic sort of renaming. It's also, the American widgeon is now in the Mareca genus. And the other species closely related to the Gadwal is not found here in the U.S., but it's the falcated duck of northern Asia. So that's about the extent of that kind of taxonomic relationship that I will get into. But there is another sort of interesting nugget associated with this species that I'll mention that I discovered. I wasn't aware of this until I really started researching this, looking for a few extra tidbits to bring to this. There was apparently an evidence of of a presumed subspecies of the Gadwal, and that was based on some observations of a couple of ducks collected in 1874 on a South Pacific island, Washington Island, to be specific there. And it was similar. It was a species similar in appearance, but much smaller, about the size of a teal, and it's presumed extinct at this time. So it's a subspecies of, presumed to be another subspecies of the Gadwal. And the other thing that I'll say here in the taxonomic discussion is that Gadwal and Mallard hybrids are one of the more well-known hybrids out there, probably second to black duck and mallard hybrids. And they have been so common, I guess, in the hybrid world that they have been given sort of a specific name, brewer's duck. And maybe there was a time where the brewer's duck was thought to be a unique species. I don't really know the history of that. But Mallard Gadwal hybrid is known as your brewer's duck.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, that's probably the more common hybrid that I've seen while hunting. I personally have never shot one, but I've definitely seen several of them. So it definitely is more common. As far as appearance goes, these are, from a distance, I would say just as a hunter and not, they're a little bit drab, but then once you get them up close, these are pretty fantastic looking birds. Yeah,
they definitely can be. I think the Gadwal, a good-looking Drake Gadwal, is one of the more handsome ducks out there. And we've tried to do some of these appearance descriptions here in the past, and that's been met with mixed success. So we'll just kind of keep this general. It's about a medium-sized duck, a little bit smaller than a mallard. The male is going to come in at about 1.5 to 2 pounds, female about 1 to 2 pounds. The male is pretty distinct by the gray herringbone pattern across much of the breast and upper flanks. Has a stark black bill. Another unique characteristic of both male and female is a pretty steep forehead. Once you look at enough or visually observe,
I'll just look.
enough ducks, you'll start to see that unique characteristic of a pretty steep forehead. Their bill is a bit shorter and definitely narrower than, let's say, a mallard, using it as a reference. The male has a very distinct black rump. And the other thing most striking about both the male and female Gadwal is going to be the wing pattern. Yeah. And we'll say that for a lot of these species. The Gadwal, both male and female, have white in the speculum, a good chunk of white. And it's the only dabbling duck that has that characteristic.
And it's a very visible white.
It is. The only you could possibly confuse it with the white patch on a widgeon, but the white patch on the widgeon is on the shoulder, shoulder patch, the coverts there. So let's see, what else do we want to say about the appearance? That's probably about, well, the female, I'll say, has the orange bill with sort of mottled black spots. So, and do we want to do some sound?
Yeah. And I think something that's cool here is we actually have some sound, and you can kind of describe this as we're going along.
Yeah. So I think what I'll try to do here, I'll play this track that's mostly courting males. Yeah, and so that those are the drakes. That's the sound that they make, and you can actually hear that quite often. I'm not sure what that whistle is we're hearing there.
Sounds like it might be a different species in the background of that
something
recording.
else in there, but that that's the call that anybody can do. You and I were talking about that a minute ago.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was going to do the audio
telling stories about how you stand up in the blind and start just doing your mouth call for Gadwal all the time.
I'm sure they love it.
Yeah, and so then here is the female. It's going to sound a lot like a mallard hen, but maybe a bit more harsh. So nothing too unique necessarily about that. She sounded,
it honestly kind of sounds
agitated. They're like maybe an alarm call.
It sounds like a monotone mallard. Like there's not really a cadence to it necessarily. Just like you said, that could have been an alarm call.
Yeah, but the Drake Gadwal call is pretty unique, pretty distinct, and it's pretty neat to hear that. And so then you can have a pretty good idea that you got a Gadwal coming around somewhere.
Well, cool. That's some fancy technology we brought to the podcast for the first time.
Thanks
Hopefully, we'll be able to do some more
there.
Yeah. So as we move on with the Gadwal, and we get into, and this is, I think, the exciting part about the Gadwal for me, it's kind of like the green-winged teal in comparison, that distribution throughout North America globally, I should even say. I think this is a great opportunity to show, just how widespread the Gadwal is and how familiar a lot of hunters are with the Gadwal.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things to talk about on the Gadwal. From a distribution standpoint, it has become pretty widespread, at least in its occurrence. It's a northern hemisphere species. Largest population is going to be here in North America. They also do occur in Eurasia and Europe, but we won't talk a whole lot about that. But here in North America, Gadwal are really interesting in them being so closely tied from a breeding standpoint to the prairies. We'll talk about some numbers associated with that here in a bit, but their stronghold for their breeding range is the prairie pothole region. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. And then from a wintering sort of distribution, we're going to be talking about greatest concentrations occurring in the southern reaches, mid and southern reaches, depending on what time of fall and winter we're talking about, in the central and Mississippi flyways. We'll have some statistics related to that a little bit later on. But they do occur pretty much in any wetland habitat, or could occur in pretty much any wetland that you find here in North America. They do breed in the Intermountain West. They breed in California. There's some breeding populations that extend a bit into the Great Lakes, maybe a little into eastern Canada, and then not too far up into the Boreal or into Alaska, but it wouldn't be uncommon to find a few odd pairs and some concentrations up there. But the heart, the the heart of their breeding range is absolutely the prairie pothole region.
Which, much like the bluewing, that really puts them, when the prairies are dry, it really puts them in a position that, you may not see, that production being kicked out of the prairies, U.S. and Canada, due to the drought, similar to this year. So that's something for people to keep in mind, that this particular species it relies heavily, I should say, on water being in the prairies.
Yeah, absolutely, in terms of their productivity. Going back to one of the comments I made about their winter distribution, to give folks an example of how this breaks out, about 80% or more of their winter distribution is going to occur, their population is going to occur in the Mississippi and Central Flyways. And you're going to get maybe 5% that will go into Mexico, and so then you may have 10% in the Pacific Flyway and maybe another 5%, kind of give or take a little bit around each of those numbers, but that kind of gives you an idea there. The other thing that I'll say, elaborate a bit on here with regard to Gadwal, is it is a species that has expanded in range. I mentioned that, but a couple of sort of factoids that sort of emphasizes this. Prior to 1939, there was no breeding record of the Gadwal in eastern Canada. Now it's not uncommon at all, not in large numbers necessarily, but you can find them readily breeding in eastern Canada. They expanded into the Great Lakes after 1960. And Ohio didn't record its first breeding Gadwal until 1979. Wow. So it's a bird that has expanded, and there's also some really, really neat population trajectories over the past 65 years that we'll talk about later on with this species.
Yeah, and as we transition into more of the wintering distribution of these birds, and I know that, like I said, it's so common. I was accustomed to pretty decent numbers of Gadwalls in Indiana, and then came down here and hunted even some parts of Mississippi, which, your home state of Mississippi is, quite the Gadwall state.
You betcha.
Those a lot of those hunters rely heavily on these wintering populations of Gadwall. So as far as wintering, they're pretty much all throughout the central Mississippi flyways. What's that total number on that?
Oh, boy. Well,
not total number of birds, but an estimated percentage, I should say.
Oh, in the Mississippi and Central Flyway, it's going to be 80%. That's the 80% number that I was talking about. Now, in terms of breeding distribution, let me see if I can pull this number from my head here. I believe 95% or more of the Gadwall population this is going to be a traditional survey area number, the kind of western North America. North of 90% of the breeding Gadwall population is going to be in the prairie pothole region.
Okay.
So when you start with that, 90% plus of the population breeding in the PPR, that kind of that extends naturally down into the Mississippi and Central Flyway during fall and winter, where about 80% of the population will occur.
Yeah, and one thing that's cool, these birds pair up a little bit earlier.
They do.
And that could be, one thing that we see sometimes hunters especially, can reference the Gadwall as, maybe easier to decoy than some other birds, and, in November, December. And then as the season progresses on, at least where I hunt, they tend to get more difficult and more difficult, and become probably the most frustrating duck that I deal with throughout the season, because we do have pretty good numbers, but they're just difficult to decoy. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think that, has something to do with the fact that they're forming that pair bond so early? So maybe they're seeking out early. They're trying to pair up.
Yeah.
And that's why maybe they're a little more susceptible to decoys. And then as they pair up, as that season transitions, their life cycle transition makes it more difficult.
Yeah, I would say that's a plausible explanation. They are unique in pairing early, and that we'll explore that conversation a little bit here. So they are seasonally monogamous. That's the predominant mating system in waterfowl, North American waterfowl, basically meaning they pair anew each year. Those pair bonds will form in fall or winter and carry through to the following summer after their breeding effort, and then the male and female go their separate way. Male does not contribute to parental care in the ducklings, and so then male and female go into the next fall and winter and will form new pair bonds. Gadwall form their pair bonds early. How early, you might be wondering? By November, somewhere, based on some past studies, have found that somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% of Gadwal are paired by November.
Oh, wow.
That's pretty early. And so why do they do that? That's been the subject of a lot of discussion, and a lot of folks, I think the dominant explanation is going to be related to their diet. Gadwal are for the most part, vegetarians. They eat mostly plant matter, leafy vegetation. We'll get into a little bit of that later on. But it's typically poor quality food, which means they have to feed a lot. And without getting into too much detail, we have to ask the fundamental question of what is the advantage at all of a hen of any type of duck pairing early. One of the things that we know is that pairs are dominant to unpaired birds. We know that dominant individuals, dominant pairs, can kind of run off and exclude other subordinate ducks or pairs to priority or higher value foraging habitats. So if you're someone, or if you're a duck that depends on a relatively poor quality diet, then you might be in a situation, or the situation might have developed, where those individuals that form pair bonds early and achieve that sort of mate defense earlier in fall and winter, you might be better positioning yourself to the higher quality foraging sites, and then therefore throughout fall and winter, you're going to be gaining the nutrients slowly, although because of poor quality food that you would need to prepare for migration and breeding. So I think that's the dominant thought there.
Okay. Yeah, no, and I'm glad you brought up, what these birds are eating, because I think this is, which we may get into this a little bit later, but, it's one fascinating conversation that I've had with hunters, because for me, growing up mid-latitude and then hunting down here in southern latitude states, we assume that the Gadwal is like great table fare. And if you talk to people who hunt up in the prairies of Canada, and I've had this conversation with Dr. Tom Mormon, our former chief scientist, but I always find it fascinating, always something to touch on. But they won't even eat them up there.
Yeah, Tom's crazy. Tom's crazy.
Yeah, but it has something to do with what they're eating, right?
Well, yeah, it absolutely does. And I don't want to get into the chemistry of all of that, because I don't know the chemistry of all of that, but it's going to relate to the nutritional components or composition of the foods they're eating, and a whole host of other things, and that would make for an interesting conversation. We'll have to do that at some point. But yes, you are what you eat, and what you eat, if you're a duck, is going to, or any kind of animal, is going to sort of flavor. It's going to help dictate your flavor, what you taste like to whoever is eating you, in the case of humans eating these foods. And yes, their quality as table fare can vary throughout the year, and that goes for any of these species of ducks. So I have had that conversation as well with Scott Stevens. He has heard it also. Some people just absolutely refuse to harvest and refuse to harvest Gadwal up on the prairies because they don't consider them good table fare. I am not in that group, because I've had good success preparing Gadwal over the years. Gadwal is a species that does have a bit of an affinity for some saline habitat, saline wetlands, and so maybe they're feeding on brine shrimp or something in those wetlands, and so maybe people are more prone to get Gadwal. Maybe Gadwal is a species that is more prone to be consuming those types of foods. I don't know. I'm just kind of spitballing here, but it is going to relate to the foods that they are eating. I've had bad experiences with various other species of ducks, and so, but yeah, Gadwal is one that's been pretty reliable. So it's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
As we go through the life cycle of this bird, we've talked about, wintering, now pair bonding. They're starting to head north. Now they're in the prairies, predominantly prairie nesting birds. How's that process rolling on, and what are they doing? Are they early arrivals? Are they later? Kind of share some of that information about the Gadwal.
Yep, I will. And I have a list of things here that we're wanting to talk about. One of the things that I forgot to say a few minutes ago is that it relates to their mating system. The Gadwal is another species that has a male-biased sex ratio, somewhere in the neighborhood of 55 to 60% male to 40 or 45% female. So some of the males are unpaired, going to go through the breeding season unpaired. In terms of their spring migration, they're one of these birds that kind of departs on sort of the same schedule as maybe some of the other species, but they arrive later. They're one of the later arriving ducks to the prairies. They are also one of the later nesting ducks that make it to the prairies. So they may begin their migration north in, let's say, March. They'll arrive on the breeding grounds April, May. And then the other thing that sort of extends from that is that they typically delay nesting for up to a month, even after they arrive on the breeding grounds. And that's probably going to relate somewhat to, again, their diet and their need to forage more heavily, more frequently to attain the resources they need, from the poor quality diet that they have. The other thing that's sort of neat about Gadwal, or unique, is that they are one of the few species, that dabbling duck species, that shows that they use endogenous protein reserves to make up some of the protein content in their eggs. Most of the other dabbling duck species will actually acquire protein reserves, the protein from the aquatic invertebrates that they're eating on the breeding grounds. Gadwal will actually mobilize some of their protein from their muscles.
Oh, wow. That's cool. As these birds are coming back, and I'm just curious about it, like, where are they going back to? Are these the type of birds who going back to the same nesting sites, or going back to the same areas? Is that the Gadwal? Is Gadwal known for that?
They are they do show some phylopatry to both breeding and wintering sites. On the breeding phylopatry side of thing, I think it can, and this is one of the things that's kind of tough to measure, but somewhere between 30 to 60% breeding site fidelity or phylopatry. There are anecdotal reports and stories from all sorts of researchers. There's one in particular where I think he was some field study, and he documented a couple of Gadwal using the exact same nest site for 2 or 3 consecutive years. So they do show female-based phylopatry to the breeding grounds. That they're not terribly unique in that regard. They follow that same pattern that many other dabbling ducks do, mallards, pintails, so forth.
Now, once they're up there, this hen's getting ready to go on the nest. Let's talk about the nest site, clutch size, nest success. So those are some things that we've talked about with some of the other species, and really broken it down exactly what this nest site looks like, what it is, how it's created, things like that.
Sure. The other thing I'll say is they're like other dabbling duck species in that they breed at 1 year of age. So birds that were hatched this year will arrive back on the breeding grounds next year, and most of those will be ready to breed and to nest.
Much like most puddle ducks.
That's right. Okay. That's right. They are, as I noted, one of the later nesting species. Peak nesting will occur in like May or June, extend into July, and that kind of relates to some of the interesting things that we'll talk about with regard to nest success and maybe some of their other metrics there. But when they go back, when they arrive, they're going to the prairies. They're going to be settling in grasslands, much like any other upland nesting duck will. They nest particularly close to wetlands in terms of nest site selection. They have a tendency to nest pretty close to wetlands. They also have a propensity for nesting on islands. If you look into the research on Gadwal et al., you will find numerous references to them being particularly drawn to island nesting situations. And by islands, we're talking about like islands out in the middle of a big lake or big pothole wetland, something like that. And that alone is it will lead them to have some extraordinarily high nest success rates in those island nesting situations. Nest sites, mid and tall grass prairies. Clutch size, it's going to be similar to other dabbling ducks, 7 to 12. The first nest, you're going to average around 10, and then with each subsequent renesting attempt, you're going to see a little bit of a drop in terms of the clutch size. In terms of renesting, since I mentioned that, they will renest. They are not as prolific as, let's say, a mallard, but there are very few species there's no other species as prolific of a renester as a mallard.
Do you think that has to do with their diet?
With the Gadwal?
Yeah.
Well, I would say that the diet is probably going to dictate the later nesting, and then the later nesting is going to be a bigger determinant in the reduced opportunities for renesting. Okay. So indirectly, yes. Yeah. But there would also be some interaction there, with their diet and the additional time required to replenish nutrients, once they've lost their nest. Incubation is by the female only. The average incubation period, there's not a whole lot of unique differences here among some of the dabblers in this regard. About 26-day incubation period. Duckling survival is relatively high. Nest survival is also relatively high, and we think those two things the duckling survival thing is particularly interesting because typically you think of later nesting ducks, later nesting hens as suffering lower duckling survival because the farther into the summer you go, the greater the chance of a wetland drying up, or in the case of a hot, dry summer, wetlands are going to dry out. So the later you nest, it's generally thought that's going to lead to lower duckling survival. But Gadwal actually do have some higher than typical duckling survival rates, and that could relate to the type of wetlands they use. They are not very prone to using the temporary wetlands. So they are instinctively kind of looking for these deeper, more permanent, semi-permanent, and permanent wetlands. They're able to use those because of their diet. That's the other thing about their foraging and their diet. It enables them to use wetlands that are deeper than those preferred by many other dabbling ducks because they're eating submerged aquatic vegetation. We need to get into some of the examples of that SAV, the submerged aquatic vegetation, here later on. But that's, again, diet is kind of feels like it's dictating a lot of their behaviors, a lot of their patterns of habitat use. And so this is another one of those. So using these more permanent wetlands probably buffers them a little from the typical consequences of late nesting, from the perspective of how it affects duckling survival. Late nesting is also, I think I'm right in this, is also thought to be partly responsible for the higher than normal nest success rates for among dabbling ducks. And if you think about it, the later you get into the nesting season, the more the vegetation is growing, and it's giving greater concealment from various predators. And there may also be some predator buffers or some prey buffering stuff going on there because they're among the later to nest, and so there could be some other predator-prey dynamics going on there. But yeah, a couple of interesting aspects of them.
Yeah, and parental care is female only, just like all puddlers. And they do have a molt during basically throughout the summer. There's explain what the timing is of that molt.
Yeah, so they do go through a wing molt. Well, yeah, they go through a wing molt. The adults will, just like all other duck and like all other waterfowl. And the males and non-breeding females, like many other species, are going to engage in molt migrations. That's where they'll leave the breeding grounds and the sort of their breeding habitats, and they'll go to some more permanent, heavily vegetated wetland where they will drop their flight feathers all sequential or simultaneously, and then they will be flightless for a period of 30 to 45 days. The Gadwal do participate in those kind of those molt migrations the way many other waterfowl do. But the the successful females, or maybe even some of the unsuccessful females that made it far into the breeding season, they also drop their flight feathers, replace their flight feathers, but they don't engage in those molt migrations as much as the males do or the non-breeding females, because both those two categories, they don't have any parental care responsibilities once it gets past sort of egg laying.
Yeah, they're just out there bumming around.
That's right, they're out there bumming around. Let's see, for the ducklings, we're talking about fledging here. Not unlike many other dabbling duck species, 50 to 60 days from the time of hatch to the time when they're able to fly. The females, you asked me a question about this on one of the previous episodes, how long the females will stay with the brood. I actually found some information on this with the Gadwal. Somewhere around 10 weeks or less, they will, the hen will leave the duckling, say, you're on your own. Go fend for yourself.
Wow, 10 weeks.
Yeah, that's it.
That's rough.
Yep.
And by this time, birds are on the move. We've kind of come full circle. We're getting back into fall. Early migration. Gadwal are really one of the species that are noticeably a part of some of those really early migrations. And is that, a part of just the species that they are, or is it also an indicator of their feeding habits? I've had this conversation with people who go to Canada to hunt, and they're like, well, we don't see any Gadwall at all. And I'm like, well, it's because you're hunting dry fields,
Yeah.
mainly. But also those very small wetlands up in the prairies, those are some of the first, those really shallow, those are some of the first to freeze. So is that an indicator of what's pushing those birds south a little bit sooner?
I think that makes sense. I think the Gadwall is going to be sort of intermediate in timing of departure from the prairies, probably not too different from shovelers. And if you think about shovelers and Gadwall, what do they have in common? They're both heavily dependent. They're obligate wetland foragers, means they have to feed they have to obtain their food from wetlands. And so, yeah, it seems that type of strategy would have developed into them having a bit of an early departure, just kind of not wanting to get caught in a situation where they are, they're faced with freezing wetlands all of a sudden. So yeah, that's probably some of the explanation there. They're a little bit. I would consider them maybe dictated a little bit by photo period, but then also there's very good evidence that their movements are kind of linked to weather patterns as well. Snow cover, temperatures, duration of sub-freezing temperature days, that type of stuff. So they're one of those species in this group that is definitely influenced by weather patterns, for sure.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. I just like to pull my own little theories out. Then you can clarify for everyone else.
Yeah.
But as far as food habits, which is important for waterfowl hunters, if you're trying to target a specific species, you want to know what these species are keying in on, what's bringing them to a certain body of water. Not coming, you'd hate to go somewhere where there's no submerged aquatic vegetation because Gadwall are so reliant on it. What are some of these different submerged aquatics that these birds are keying in on?
They are essentially vegetarian, and that means that they are going to be eating various parts of plants, whether that be seeds, whether that be leafy vegetation from some aquatic plants, or algae. They even eat algae. Now, they do eat invertebrates to some extent, but the overwhelming majority of their diet is going to be plant-based. So in terms of some particular examples, a whole host of different pondweed species, that's a Potamogeton is the
bless you
the genus for that group of plants. That's a really interesting group of aquatic plants. There's all sorts of different species tied with that genus. I mentioned algae. There's also a family of submerged aquatic vegetation known as naiad. Water milfoil, Eurasian water milfoil, interestingly enough, is it's an invasive, it's an exotic, and in some cases it can be invasive. Some places it is a problematic species, but it's been documented repeatedly that Gadwall will use it as a dietary item. So, and in fact, some places, certainly in coastal Louisiana, they kind of like to have it. I mean, maybe there's a species that they would rather have, let's say widgeon grass, but they're certainly not going to frown upon the existence of water milfoil or try to get rid of it. So yeah, I mentioned widgeon grass is another one. Duckweed, Gadwall have been documented consuming duckweed. That's that little floating grass or floating leaved vegetation.
Real small.
That's right. Coontail, Ceratophyllum demersum. That's what you refer to it as, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought. First thing that popped in my head.
But they also do eat crustaceans and other aquatic invertebrates. As I mentioned, they do feed in some of the deeper wetlands than what we typically think of.
Yeah.
So, and I think that is maybe what has contributed to their expansion. As you think about the proliferation of stock tanks, retention ponds, impoundments of whether we're talking about hydroelectric, whether we're talking about reservoirs for whatever purpose that are maybe too deep for typical dabbling duck foraging behaviors. So some of these other larger bodies of water may have areas that will produce submerged aquatic vegetation that Gadwall can use, but some other dabbling ducks can't. So I think that is gonna actually come into play with regard to this expansion.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said, they're pretty opportunistic as far as habitat goes, and that probably leads them for hunters to run into them so much. But
one other thing about foraging behavior of these birds is pretty neat. It's kleptoparasitism. You know what that is?
No, enlighten us.
Kleptoparasitism is a behavior where an individual will actually steal. You kind of think about kleptomaniac, a person that has a compulsion to steal. So kleptoparasitism is the behavior of stealing food from another individual. So Coots and Widgeon and Gadwall kind of intermingle into this group that will kleptoparasitize one another. They will wait on. They'll let someone else do the finding of the food, and then they'll go up and steal it from them.
Yeah, which is a good point for hunters. If you're focusing on Gadwall habitat and you're using coot decoys, a lot of people will use coot decoys as more or less as confidence decoys and makes some birds feel comfortable. These coot decoys actually serve as a notification for these Gadwalls that there's potentially a food source there.
That's right. Food source either in the water or the bill of the coot.
That's right. They're fighting for it. That's why I used to have a big 13 dozen coot decoy spread, and we called it Gadwall bait.
Yeah,
because they would just bomb right in just on oxbows off the Mississippi River, and they would coming in. I just want to clarify something that you said for our audience. You mentioned one of these specific species of pondweed or a submerged aquatic vegetation. You referred to it as use it as a dietary item. And I just want to clarify to our audience that means they're just going to eat it. But I appreciated that. That was a fantastic note.
I see a pattern.
I see a pattern. All right. So then once you get into this winter distribution, that's kind of where I was going with. Very common for hunters to see because of that winter distribution. Lots of hunters out there are running into Gadwall. Some people, prefer Gadwall over just about any other species. I know a couple guys that definitely do. But kind of expand on that a little bit and get into, I know you have some numbers as far as survival and harvest and things like that. I think that's just fascinating to hear the number side of it.
Yeah, so in terms of winter distribution, I know I mentioned that about 80% of these of this species is going to occur in the Mississippi and Central Flyway. It's a very, very important bird for hunters of coastal portions of the Gulf Coast, and the Gulf Coast is very important for this bird. The coastal marshes of Louisiana, coastal marshes of Texas produce large quantities of their preferred foods, and so that's why you see such a strong association there. In terms of think about other areas, the Gunnersville Reservoir in Alabama is, I think, another one where Gadwall are known to be a very abundant species, and we could probably go down the list.
Anybody who bass fishes knows that Gunnersville is full of coontail.
Oh yeah,
and so that makes the kind of the correlation there.
Yep. You don't find them very much in flooded timber. I'm sure everyone has an experience of where they did, but it's not one of their preferred habitat types. Now, in terms of annual survival, we can kind of move into some of this discussion here, and then we'll get into harvest statistics a little bit later on, which also will tell us a little bit about the distribution of this bird. I didn't find a whole lot on annual survival rates for this species. We don't band a whole lot of them, and of course, we get our survival data from our survival estimates from our banding data.
Is that because it's harder to catch these birds?
I think it's going to go back to their diet and what they eat, to kind of talk in Chris Jennings terms.
What they use as a dietary item.
They eat.
Yes.
It's just most of the birds that we band are captured by the use of bait. We put out bait in cages or in rocket nets, in front of rocket nets, and we try to attract them to these sources of bait. That's how we catch them. It's harder to do that if you can't put out what it is they're wanting to eat, right? Now you can, and Paul Link in Louisiana, associated with a couple of research projects for Gadwall, and Jacob Gray also is a master student at LSU. We ultimately, or they, I won't take credit for any of the field work that they did, they tried using all sorts of different seeds to try grain to try to attract them to trap sites. They would have very little success in that regard. Ultimately, in order to capture the Gadwall that they wanted for their study, they simply drove around and tried to find locations where Gadwall were consistently loafing, just on a little a mud flat or a log or something of that nature. And then they called them blind rocket net sets, where there was no food or no bait or anything of that nature, trying to lure the the Gadwall to that particular site, but they just knew based on repeated observations that Gadwall are there. And so they would just go set these rocket nets, and eventually they caught their sample. But they were very, very difficult to lure to bait site, to trap sites. So yeah, we have a very difficult time catching a large number of them and banning large number of them. In terms of annual survival rates that I did find, annual survival rates about 60% for both adult male and female. And then when you drop down to the juveniles, you're looking at about 50% annual survival rate for both male and female, juvenile male and female. So, yeah. Now, harvest rates, I could not find anything on harvest rates for this species. I would guess it's going to be somewhere in the, 8 to 10% range if I had to guess, because you need to think about adult male mallards, the one we know most about. We harvest those at a rate of about 12%, 10, 12, 13%. Wood ducks we harvest at a little higher rate than that. So, I would guess Gadwall is, I don't know. It's somewhere between 8 and 14%.
Yeah.
But it's not a large harvest rate, I don't think. Now, somebody, if someone out there knows and wants to,
I think if you're looking at it from a North American average too, these birds are a little bit more limited in their range. But people hunt them. People like them. You know? Yeah. I think the most important thing to talk about here is the not the harvest rate, but the harvest percentage.
Well, now we do have, or the overall harvest. We do have that. Absolutely, we have good estimates of annual harvest.
And can you define the difference between those two?
Harvest and harvest
rate and harvest.
Absolutely, harvest is going to be the total number of birds that we have harvested. Harvest rate is going to be the percentage of a population that we harvest. So let's say if a Gadwall harvest rate was 10%, that would mean that of all the Gadwall that were alive at the start of fall, we would have harvested 10% of that, right? And so then at the end of the season, after we've collected all of our data from hunters that are participating in these hunter diary surveys, wing bee surveys, we get an estimate of a million Gadwall harvested. Then you could extrapolate and say at the beginning of fall, that would have meant there would have been about 10 million Gadwall in the fall flight. That is basically what I just tried to come up with. There is essentially the guts of the Lincoln-Peterson estimation method that I've been asked about a few times.
Yeah.
So in terms of harvest, on average across the U.S., over the period of about 1999 through 2017, there were 1.5 million Gadwall harvested annually. 1.5 million Gadwall harvested annually. That's about 10% of the total duck harvest. So nothing to sneeze at there. Mallard, of course, leads the way in terms of that total harvest. Gadwall is going to be, I think, typically ranks number 3 on average in terms of its importance in harvest. So the Mallard is going to be one. I forget who is number 2. I think it's the green-winged teal, and then followed by Gadwall. But if you look from year to year, Gadwall is going to be, it may be 2 in one year, maybe 3, it's 4. It's always in that range, but on average, it's the 3rd most harvested species. In terms of importance across the flyways, it's going to be most important in the Mississippi and Central flyways. So when we look across all 4 flyways where that harvest occurs, 55% of it occurs in the Mississippi flyway, 30% in the Central flyway, about 10% in the Pacific, and then about 3, 4, 5 in the Pacific flyway. I don't know if my math added up there.
3, 4, 5 in the Atlantic flyway, you should say.
What did I say?
You think you said Pacific again.
Okay.
But I caught it,
Yeah. So, 3 or 4 in the Atlantic. So in terms of where they rank within each flyway, like if you're an Atlantic flyway hunter, you want to know where Gadwall rank out in terms of overall importance. They're not very high. I really couldn't come up with exactly where they were. They're going to be like number 7, 8, or 9, in terms of importance. In the Mississippi and Central flyway, it ranks 2nd on average. In the Mississippi flyway, we're looking at about 890,000 Gadwall harvested.
Wow.
In the Central flyway, about 500,000. Pacific flyway, they come in around 5 or 6, about 170,000 Gadwall harvested annually in the Pacific flyway. Highest harvest states, you want to take a guess?
Your typical,
the typical
Texas, Louisiana, let's say California.
Yeah. Louisiana is one. Texas is 2, Arkansas is 3, then California, North Dakota, Mississippi, and Missouri.
If you start any conversation with, highest harvest rates, it usually starts with Texas, California, Louisiana, typically, and then mix in a few states there.
Until it comes to green-winged teal, and where you're gonna suggest Utah.
Oh yeah, that's right. You are correct.
Yeah, we don't want to go back there. You were thinking about a different one.
I was. Population status overall.
Yes, they are. This is where it gets really interesting, or I should say, another really interesting part of what we've seen with this species. If you look at, they're very healthy. Mm-hmm. Population of Gadwal are very healthy. They've never been healthier. If you look over the past 5 or so years, obviously we're probably seeing a bit of a downturn in their population right now, along with all other prairie nesting species. If you go back to the 50s, and let's say 1955 to 1965, this is based on our population data from the Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey, the average breeding population size for Gadwal during that 10-year period was 745,000. 745,000. From 1966 to 1990, the population increased, and over that time period, it averaged 1.5 million. Wow. So it doubled.
Yeah.
And then it really gets exciting starting around the early 90s. From 1991 to 2019, the average breeding population size of Gadwal has been 2.9 million.
That's almost a direct correlation to abundance of water in the prairie pothole region. Would you agree?
And CRP.
Okay.
I think CRP, and you can see it with a number of these species, prairie nesting species. If you look at the graph, they were low in the 50s and mid 60s. They jump up around 70s, the early 70s, and then they kind of flatline at that 1.5 million range or so, and then we get into the late 80s and we're in a drought. But also 1986 was the introduction of the U.S. Farm Bill. Conservation Reserve Program came on and began to put a lot of grassland restoration on the landscape in the prairies. And once the prairies got wet in the early 90s, you had a bunch of grass out there, and then you had all those wetland basins refill. Gadwal populations exploded. They went up to about 3 million or something like that, and over the course of 3 or 4 years. It's truly, truly remarkable. They came down in the mid to late 90s, and then beginning in about 2005, they began another uptrend, and then here, of course, the past couple of years, they've gone back down.
Yeah.
But you're right, it's going to be, the ups and downs are going to be a reflection of the grassland base that's out there, but then once you add the water into it as well, it's what's responsible for that year-to-year variation, but when you look at it over a more decadal, let's say, time frame, it's going to be that the stronger interaction of the amount of grass nesting habitat that's on the landscape and the wetland conditions. So it's pretty cool. And you see a similar response with some of the other prairie nesting species like blue-winged teal, northern shoveler. They show a similar trend. And so to put those numbers into perspective, let's look at it relative to the North American Waterfowl Management Plan goal. It's 1.9 million is the NAWAMP goal. That reflects the long-term average from 1955, I think, to 2012. Mm-hmm. So we are well above the NAWAMP goal. And to kind of give you some idea of the peaks that have occurred here over the past 20 or so years, 3.9 million in 1997. I think I briefly alluded to that in my description of the graph. And then they averaged 3.8 million from 2014 to 2017 with a peak of 4.2 million in 2017. And now those numbers that I'm talking about there are just going to be what we call the traditional survey area, the prairie pothole region, western boreal forest, Alaska. And so you can add a few additional 100,000 from some of the other breeding regions. But yeah, it's a really, really bright story among the upland nesting duck species there in the prairies, for sure.
Yeah. Now, just kind of to wrap this up, one thing that we kind of hinted on, at least I always hint on, is the hunting insights and talking about some specific tactics. I talked about the old coot spread, the Gadwal bait. Always, fairly. Not telling everyone to go out and buy 13 dozen coot decoys, although it might not be a bad idea. Just got to figure out how to store them. But really, calling. There are specific techniques for calling Gadwal. A lot of people do it.
Do you find that they decoy well?
It depends. I have not found them to respond to the call
that you, or is that just?
I think it might be user error with the
okay.
call. You know, some of the habitats that I'm hunting are not as large rice fields. I think the guys who were hunting them in cypress breaks and on these other ponds, you know, some of these maybe where they were more feeding, and I think they have a much greater success calling and decoying these birds. I
will say that a beautifully decoying Gadwal will rival a beautifully decoying mallard.
Ooh, that's the most Mississippi thing you've ever said.
I've seen a couple of good examples.
Yeah, no, and I think all respect to the Gadwal. I'm just joking around. It's a fantastic species to hunt. Like I said, great table fare. I've seen just clouds and clouds of these things, you know, decoying that is spectacular. Again, I've also had these things just be the thorn in my side in a duck blind.
Because you think of them as an inferior species, and you think ought to be able to decoy those things in every time, right?
Yeah, and then
they're not.
No, yeah.
They're a really cool bird. A beautiful Drake Gadwal is nothing to sneeze at.
Yep, absolute respect for the Gadwal. I hope that everyone learned a little bit about the Gadwal. Mike, did you have anything else to add before we get out of here?
I probably do, but let's for the sake of, I don't even know if I can say sake of brevity at this point, but for the sake of wrapping it up, let's not add anything else.
Absolutely, we appreciate it. I'd like to thank my co-host, Dr. Mike Brasher, for coming to the table today with tons of awesome Gadwal information. I hope our listeners really soak that up. It's great, handy little bits of information you can have to talk with your buddies in the blind. I'd like to thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for putting the show together and getting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on the DU Podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.